on out. Hopefully people are able to get in and hear things. You can put things in chat. Sorry. Let me try muting real quick. I love technology. All right. Sorry about that. Always a fun way to start things. But welcome on out. We are doing a legislative review today to go through some of the things to know when you're working with Utah legislature or when you're looking at bills. We have a lot of laws that are proposed and a lot of things that take place during this time. And so these are things that are very good to be involved with because the laws can greatly impact Utah, can greatly impact its future. Oftentimes we don't see the impact of them for a little while, but these are things that are very important to be involved in. So just to give you a little background, while we are still working to get everyone fully joined, Believe is an organization that is working to help people be proactive in doing good. I'm an attorney by training. I've done a fair amount with the legislature over time. And we love it when people are involved, people are proactive working with the legislature. And we like to try and help out with that as well. And so during this time, you're free to ask any questions if you have something in chat that you'd like to ask. We'd like this to be a discussion as well. So as we go through it, you're welcome to ask questions. If there's anything that's on your mind or anything you wanted to know, feel free to ask. And then during the week as well, we have the option for people to be part of Microsoft Teams. It has a chat feature, document sharing feature, collaboration feature, a few things. So if you want to be part of that, you can let us know. And we will continue discussions throughout the week because there's too much to cover in the little bit of time we have together. But to get started today, I want to, share my screen here. And get this up. Show a little bit about the belief side of things. This is something that we strongly believe and kind of take to heart with what we do. We believe that people are good, but we don't believe it's enough just to be good. We think too often when we're good, that's meaning that we think we're not doing something bad. But we feel strongly you must be good for something. You must contribute good to the world. The world must be a better place for your presence. And the good that is in you must be spread to others. And so we believe strongly the world can be a better place when people like you, like others, work to share the good and spread the good. And that's what we're hoping to do this legislative session. The law is something that can be complex, but it's not something that has to be, it's not something that has to be out of reach of people. And so you are able to see, things you can do, you can understand things, you can be involved with things. And that is, that's an opportunity for all of us. And so as you go through this, think about the things you're interested in, because if there's something you're interested in, you can look at those bills. We feel strongly you can get to understand them, understand their impact, and be able to help shape those, even if you don't understand the complete workings of the law together. In our discussions, we do ask that you follow certain rules and believe, we try and work with many people across many different belief systems, across many different political systems, and we do very much require respect, civility. We ask you to be open about sharing your beliefs and opinions, and we do ask that you listen to learn and not listen to attack. I think our political mindset is often trained to thinking of the next argument back or something, but this is really a chance to come to understand and learn, more than it is to convince someone that you're right about something. We want you to share your points, to share what you understand and why, but do it in a way that's inviting, to explain who you are, why you think it's good or bad, to talk about some of the pros and cons, because almost everything in the law is there to address an issue. And quite often those are real issues that exist. And while we may not agree on whether government should be involved in that issue or not, or we may not agree on how it's being addressed, we can have respect for the fact that there is an issue, and we can talk about what's the appropriate way to handle that. So to start off, I don't know if anyone has any questions immediately. If you do, feel free to ask them. But I thought I could talk a little bit about how laws are interpreted, and then go through the Utah legislative website a little bit and actually look at some bills, go through some bills and some laws, so that you can have a little bit of introduction to those. And then again, as we go through these each week, we'll go through this quite a bit, and I think you'll see this. So jump in if you have a question or something you want to ask. But generally, when you're interpreting law, you judges and the law itself takes the position that all words matter. They don't believe generally that there's extra words that don't mean something when you're reading a statute or a bill. And so the drafting attorneys, that they're trained to only use words that matter, that have a meaning of some sort. And so you can't ever look at a law and say, oh, those ones don't really mean anything, they're just there. The judges are going to strike an interpretation where the words have a meaning. Some of the words that come up often are the words shall and may. These two are used quite a bit. And in general, the other thing about this is almost everything in the law is in general. There's usually an exception or two to this. But the word shall usually means mandatory. So if it says that the government shall get a warrant, for example, then that means that the government has to get a warrant unless there's an exception listed somewhere, or unless a court creates one, which can often happen. And so even if the law says shall, one of the exceptions is sometimes courts will find reasons to justify not following that or create an exception to that. But in general, if you're reading it, that is what shall means. The word may is permissive. So for example, if it says the government may pass a law or the government may regulate something, sometimes people will get frustrated saying the government hasn't regulated it, hasn't done anything, and say, well, yes, they have discretion on whether they do or not. It's not required. It's just giving them authority if they want to do that. The word and is used often when they're talking about conditions that have to exist. So for example, sometimes the law will say, if they're speeding and drunk, then there's an enhanced penalty versus if you were just speeding. And for that enhanced penalty to apply, both factors have to be met because the word and is there. But if it's the word or, if the law says you'll go to jail for taking a gun onto school property or for pretending you have a gun, you don't actually have to have a gun on school property in order to get in trouble, because the or means just one of the factors has to be satisfied. And so that gets, again, it gets funny because you'll start to find the way that they draft things. Sometimes the and will mean or, because they'll say something, for example, that says factors are met, and then they'll list 10 factors and have an and at the end. But because it's said at the start, if any one of the following factors are met, then something applies, then that and means or in that situation. It's not great. I don't love it when the drafting attorneys do that, but it does happen a fair amount. So again, when you look at these are general rules, but you still have to look at the bigger context to see what's taking place in the law. Let's see. And then we have something to understand that the law itself doesn't always follow plain English. You can read a word in it and think you know what it means, but the law can actually define its own words and give them meaning outside of normal English. So as an example of one, there's a law in Utah that talks about student data and privacy with student data. And if you look at student data just from a normal English perspective, you'd think, I know what student data is. It's the information they collect on students. But if you look at the law actually defines student data to be certain things, but not to include other things. And so if you read it with a plain English interpretation, it looks like the law applies to all student data until you look at the definition and realize, oh, they're only talking about specific pieces of student data because that's all it's defined to be. And so, well, I'll show you today where those definitions are found generally, for the most part, so that you can always remember to look for definitions to know what's defined, what might change the meaning of something beyond normal English. Another thing to understand is if two parts of a statute might conflict, then the judges will always try and interpret it in a way to resolve the conflict. And this goes back to that first principle that all words have meaning. If you read one part of a statute and it says one thing and then another part says another thing, the judges will say, yeah, that might conflict if we interpret it that way, but there's another way to interpret it where it doesn't conflict. And that's the interpretation that they will generally go with. So when you read a statute, you have to look at the bigger picture. And again, look at everything as a whole to say, what's the thing doing altogether? And I'll show you an example of that from a real case that's going on right now, where there is a potential conflict in the statute and the judge has to decide what they're going to do with that. And then another thing to understand about the law is that recent additions to the law generally carry more weight than the older parts of the law. And it's common for the law to evolve over time and to become something bigger than it has been. And so with that, we are looking at pieces that get added. And when a piece gets added and it might conflict, or sometimes there's a kind of a conflict that can't be resolved through interpretation. And in that situation, if a piece is newer, they will say that that newer piece is modifying the older piece and maybe amending that or getting rid of that older piece. So you also have to check the dates that things are modified, look at some of those modifications to know what language might prevail. And again, Utah actually does a really good job of helping track that. And so you'll see that on the website as well in just a minute. And then the last little bit of information to know for today is if the words are clear and there's not really a question as to what it means, the judge will enforce it as written unless it violates some kind of public policy or the Constitution or something. But if the law is ambiguous and we don't know exactly how to interpret it, we don't know exactly what it means, at that point, the judges may look to legislative intent to try and figure out what the legislature meant when they did that. But you don't get to legislative intent if the language is pretty clear. The judges will just follow that as the first sign of intent. So it's a little bit about some of the basics, looking at interpreting statutes. Are there any questions from anyone on any of what we just discussed there? Just making sure I'm not missing anything. Let's see. And yes, to the question of sharing the PowerPoint, I'd be happy to. And this is also being recorded, and we'll try and put it up on the web too for people to be able to go back and look at. So we'll go on though to looking at some actual laws on the legislative website. Let's here. So this is the Utah State Legislative website. It's at le.utah.gov. You can see up there. Utah has a very good website for creating some transparency in what's going on in government. Obviously, I don't know if things can ever be fully transparent, but Utah does work very hard at that. And I've been very impressed with Utah's website, their ability to put laws up and make it so that people can follow those. So you can see on the website when you first come on, there's calendars about things that are taking place. You can click on it and see different things that are scheduled. There's a lot of floor time or committee time that appears. And this will kind of help you if you're trying to follow the session very closely. You can go by the calendar. But if you're just interested in a particular bill or topic, you can follow that as well. If you come up here to bills and click on the 2023 bills, this takes you to information about the session. There's House bills, Senate bills. Those are some of the more important pieces of things. Where you have the House of Representatives that proposes bills in the Senate. There's generally more bills proposed in the House because there's more officials in the House. The Senate covers more area than the House does, and there's less senators in Utah. Both the House and the Senate have to vote on a bill and approve it. And then that bill gets sent to the governor to be signed or vetoed. And if it's vetoed, the legislature does have a chance to try and override the veto if they can get enough votes. But generally, I'd say a decently high percentage of bills that get passed by both the Senate and the House in Utah get approved by the governor. But you can click on any of these to expand and see at least a description for these bills. Utah has a requirement that a bill can only relate to one subject. And so they're not supposed to be able to put a bunch of different subjects in a bill to try and sneak something through. If people are voting on one thing, they're supposed to be voting on that one thing. I personally think that's a good thing, that each bill is required to be one subject only. But even in that, you'll see that that can get stretched a little bit sometimes. And sometimes the bills do more than just their title would have you believe. But we can look at a bill. We'll go to HB 61, one that might be of some interest to people, talking about school safety requirements. So if you click on it and pull it up, Utah gives you a bunch of information on this page. They let you know who the bill sponsor is. You can also click on the bill sponsor to be able to get contact information for them if you want to reach out to them. Once there's a floor sponsor, you'll be able to see that as well. And so the bill sponsor, it's originating in the House, and so it'll be a representative that sponsors that bill. Once it gets voted on by the House, if it moves to the Senate, they'll have a floor sponsor in the Senate. And the floor sponsor is the person in the other chamber who is now putting forth that bill in that chamber. So any bill that gets passed will have both a bill and a floor sponsor, but bills when they start out can start with just a bill sponsor. You can check the status of the bill at any time by clicking on the status tab. They go through and tell you exactly what's happened with the bill, where it's come from, where it's going, what may be scheduled for it. If there's hearings or floor debates, committee hearings or floor debates scheduled, you'll be able to see it on the bill itself. So you won't have to watch the calendar in particular. You'll be able to see what's there, which can be very helpful to know. And so that's a little bit there, but the bill text, when you come to it, we'll go through this so you can understand a little bit of what's happening. I guess one other thing before we do that, on the tracking page, bill tracking, You can click on this to actually track the bill. You create an account with Utah, and you can let them know which bills to email you on or give you notifications on, so that anytime there's an update on that bill, anytime a vote's been taken or it's been assigned to a committee, you're able to see that and know about it. So with bills, right now we have a bill sponsor, but all bills have to go to a committee first, which is a smaller group of representatives that meet. They're generally focused on particular topics. So you could have a health committee, for example, or a finance committee. And in general, bills with those subjects will go to those committees. And the committee has to give it a favorable vote to be able to get it to go to the entire House to be voted on. Those committee hearings, as the public, you're welcome to go to the committee hearings. You're welcome to actually speak at the committee hearings. If it's a very popular topic, you may have to get there early to try and get in line to be able to have enough time to speak. But in general, for a lot of the bills, you can get up and speak to those committees. You can share things, and they welcome public input on those. And quite a few committee hearings go by without public input. I've been to some where there was me and maybe a handful, one or two other people there. And some I don't think the public really shows up to. There's some they don't care a lot about. I've obviously been to some that have hundreds of people in attendance as well. But you have the opportunity at the committee hearing to really help either get a bill out that you want to be presented to the House to vote on, or if it's you consider it a bad bill, you don't want it to go anywhere, you have a good shot at the committee to get them to not vote on it, so that it never even goes to the full House to be voted on, or the full Senate. And so those committee hearings are powerful places. It's a place for you to articulate things and be part of things. And you can also look, Utah has this committees tab up here, where you can go and see the different committees, see the members of those committees. And if you see that a bill you're interested in has been assigned to a committee, you can actually contact those representatives just on that committee to tell them how you feel about the bill. But in Utah, when we have it, we have so this is a bill proposing school safety requirements. Now, we obviously have an issue currently where we can have shootings at schools or other issues. And so school safety is a fairly, it's a fairly expansive topic, one that I think will be talked about for quite a while moving into the future, what we do or don't do about it. And you can see here that there was a law enforcement and criminal justice interim committee recommended this bill. 12 people voted for it, 0 voted against, and 5 were absent. And so on this committee note here, they'll kind of give you a summary. You can see 12-0-5, which just means 12-4-0 against, 5 absent. And then Utah gives you a little overview of the bill, so you can kind of see from a quick overview of what's happening. Honestly, a lot of legislators up at the Capitol, this is about all that they read of these bills, and less constituents like you bring up concerns with it. They'll look at the general description and they'll look at the highlighted provisions. So if you look here, it tells you this bill defines terms. So let's always assign there's definitions like we talked about. It creates a state security chief position within the Department of Public Safety. So it sounds like we're creating a new position in the state if this bill passes for a state security chief. It creates a school security task force. It requires the task force to develop qualifications and things of the state security chief. It requires that all secondary schools have a school resource officer. And it makes some amendments to make it so it fits in with existing code. Technical and conforming amendments usually mean it's not changing the substance, it's usually changing numbering or positions or something like that to make it fit within the existing code. It then goes down and tells you the code provisions it amends. Utah's really good with everything they put out. You can click on these to actually see what's being amended. They have hyperlinks to each one of them, which is super helpful. Again, they pull it up here on the side to show you which laws are being affected by this. Now you'll see with this that there's multiple laws being affected, because Utah's requirement for one subject in a bill, you can affect thousands of laws technically. There's no limit on the number of laws you can affect. It's just that the subject itself, you can only be voting on one subject. But they'll go through and articulate all the different laws that might need to change. So when you look at the bill and you're trying to understand what it means, you'll see underlined text like this. Underlined means it's new. It's something they're proposing to add to the law. And so this section 53-22-101, it says is enacted to read. And that's telling you that it's a new section that's never existed before. When they say enacted, you can see that they actually have, it's all underlined, which means it's all new too. If you scroll down a little bit on this bill, you'll see that they get down to a part where everything's not underlined. And they'll say that section 53G-8-701 is amended to read. So this is an existing law, but now they're adding some additional language to it. So let's just look quickly at some of the things that this is doing. This first provision, the section 101 that they're putting in new definitions. You can see them say School Security Act definitions. So before you read the bill, and this is the case with all legislation, you generally want to see what they're defining. Here they're defining public school, they're defining school resource officer, and they're defining state security chief. So those three terms may mean something different than you would expect. They have a very legal definition, so when those are used, you have to look at the legal definition of what those are. Each of those sections, each of the definitions references another section. So you'd actually have to click on that hyperlinked section to see what it really is being defined. And you may have to click another hyperlink and another hyperlink. Sometimes these hyperlinks or these connections can go a few layers deep to fully understand what's taking place. But most of the time they will define them without hyperlinks. But this is one where they reference three of them. But we can see here the state security chief means an individual appointed by the commissioner under section 5322-102. That section is a new section as well. And so right here, they're saying there's created within the department a state security chief. So a new position they're proposing. And they're saying then what the state security chief is supposed to do. So we're going to see some of these terms of statutory interpretation that we talked about. So it's 1 and 2, and then it moves to the sub A, sub B, sub C, sub D. That means that A through D all fits under sub 2 and applies to that. And then the sub I, double I, triple I, those fall under D. So those subparts all apply to subpart D. But the state security chief, it looks like, has four main things they're talking about. A says it's appointed by the commissioner with the approval of the governor. And B says is subject to the supervision and control of the commissioner. And then it says also may be removed at the will of the commissioner. So when it says may, that means the commissioner can remove them, but doesn't have to. It's permissive. And then in D, we get to a shall. So this is mandatory. And the state security chief has to be qualified by experience and education to enforce the laws of the state relating to school safety, perform duties prescribed by the commissioner, and enforce rules made under this chapter. And then in 3, they say the duties and responsibilities of the state security chief shall be determined by the commissioner of public safety in conjunction with the school security task force created in section 53-22-104. That's also a new section. If you look down just slightly, you'll see the school security task force. So this bill is saying we want to take school safety a little more seriously. We want a state security chief, and we want a school security task force. The next section, though, doesn't quite get to the task force yet, and it says that each county sheriff shall, so that's mandatory, the county sheriff has to, identify an individual within the sheriff's office to coordinate security responsibilities with the state security chief. So the state security chief is supposed to have a connection in each county sheriff's office to be able to help carry out school safety matters. And then we get to this section that goes through who makes up the school security task force, talks about membership. You can read through that to see, if you agree for the people serving on it, whether it's a good idea or not. In subsection 2, so if you look at subsection 1, you see the 1, and when it says it's composed of the following 15 members, you see the A, B, C, D. That's all under sub 1. So if you don't care about the membership, you can skip down to C2 to see what's the next thing the law is talking about. And you say the task force shall, and then it goes through and talks about what they are supposed to do as the task force. And again, this is a shall, so it's mandatory. It's not something that they can choose to do. And they're supposed to help create these responsibilities for the state security chief. B says they're supposed to create statewide standardized training requirements and hiring policies for school resource officers. They're supposed to review and revise, if necessary, the model critical incident response training, develop training standards for active shooter and emergency response in schools, recommend safety and security protocols for the design, construction, and reconstruction of new and existing schools. And then it says, develop legislation to accomplish subsections A through E for introduction in the 2024 general session. So they're supposed to propose new laws for 2024. And then it says and. So they have to do all of these. It's not an or, they can't pick and choose. And they're supposed to present a report to the Law Enforcement and Criminal Justice Interim Committee by basically the end of this year. So it goes through, it talks about a few things there, but you'll start to see here when we go through and actually look at some more laws being changed. You'll see some of the other things that are taking place. So it talks about school resource officer training curriculum. So they're adding some things in that they can do as part of that. You'll get down here where you see these items with the lines through them. Those are things that existed in old code, but they're being taken out and replaced with the new things. And so you see here, for example, school safety used to be something that an LEA, which is a local educational authority, is used to say they may contract with local law enforcement to provide school resource officer services. Now they're changing it to say if this bill passes, it's a shall, it's mandatory. You have to have a contract with local law enforcement to have someone in the school. And then again, they shall develop a mutually agreed upon contract for the school resource officer. And so they're going through deleting some of these old things that were there, changing some of it. Some of it's just based on the way things were said before, they're cleaning it up a little bit. But some of it has meaning with, if they change a shall or a may or an and or an or they go through and add things like this in. And then the reason they have all this code here, it's not underlined and not crossed out, is because the law requires that for each code provision that exists, they have to put the whole thing in and show it's being changed out of that section. So this is a section of code, and I'll show you a little bit more about how we find those. But that's one section of code. So the whole section goes in, even though all they're doing to this section is adding one line. So it can make the bill look really long if you're adding one line to a long code section. That comes in. And then you get to this interesting thing at the end that some of you might be interested in. This says right here that section 53-22-104 is repealed December 31st, 2023. That's the end of this year. So we go, wait, what's it repealing at the end of this year? You click on it, and it actually takes you right up to it. This is the same law we just looked at. the School Security Task Force is only created through the end of this year. And so this bill creates this task force. It gets this state security office going, essentially, recommends legislation, and then it expires and stops existing before the next legislative session. And that's common that Utah will talk about when things expire. So this is a section of code right here that actually says when laws are repealed or expire. And you go through this, and it's a long provision. They have more than this too about when things expire. But there's a lot of different laws that will expire at certain dates in the future. There's a number of reasons they do that, but it's always good to know when you're looking at legislation if the law is going to change the expiration of something. One of the big contention points that came up a little bit ago with the law expiring was the speed limit on Legacy Highway. They had, when they passed the low speed limit, the 55 miles per hour, they'd said that it would be in place for, I don't remember what it was, 10 years or something. And at the end, when that law was being expired, or when it was set to expire, they tried to pass legislation to extend it, saying that they wanted to keep it that way because it supposedly leads to less pollution. But ultimately, that extension that they proposed was not passed, and the Legacy Highway speed limit, the lower speed limit, expired, and now it's I think, a 65 mile per hour speed limit. So that's at least kind of a quick overview of a bill, and in general, what you're going to see with the bill. Sometimes you'll see ones where everything is brand new, everything's underlined. In that case, it's an entirely new law that they're proposing. Here it's a mix. They have some new laws and some changes to laws that are there. And sometimes it's just changes to existing laws. So are there any let's see. Look at the questions here. So asking about how many new bills there are. We never know. I don't think anyone ever knows for sure on the number of new bills. This is a question from the chat. But if you go again to bills and view the 2023 bills, the session hasn't started yet. And if you click on this, there are 197 numbered bills. Sometimes they skip a few numbers. So I know the first 10 aren't there. But these are the House, usually by the end of the session, because they can introduce bills all throughout the session. Usually by the end, there's over 500, 400 or 500 from the House. And then the Senate currently is up to an 88 numbered. And I know that someone had the question about property taxes. So there is one bill on property tax that we can look at and go through, or at least touching some with property tax. But as we go through these, if you see any that you really want to look at and know what they're talking about, we can go through them in these discussions. I can go through those before we can get ready to talk about it. And that is one of the goals, is to give you the ability to say what it is you want to talk through, or what things interest you. Now, Utah is here again, proposing sales tax amendments. Utah loves to play with sales tax. But this one, if you look at it, at least based on its highlighted provision, this is a pretty simple change. It's clarifying that if you have an exemption certificate from sales tax, you have to get it renewed. So that one isn't changing our tax rate. It's just saying essentially how long an exemption certificate's good for. And you can see here, even in this one, most of this section isn't being touched. It's just listed because it has to be to show what's being changed. And it's just this little bit at the end here to clarify that there has to be a renewal of that exemption certificate. And then it also says when it applies, this bill actually applies, it says retrospective to January 1st. In general, in Utah, you will not see that often, but they will with tax law sometimes do that to make them apply back to the first of the year to modify things for that entire tax year. Let's see, I just want to check the chat here real quick. And so yes, to the question about the expiration date, the expiration date means they will usually revisit it to see if they want to extend it. And sometimes what they do, the federal government loves doing expiration dates and sunsets on bills where, for example, if they know that a Democrat president or a Republican president is in his last term, because he's been in for 2 terms now, they'll pass provisions, beneficial provisions that will sunset during the next president's term. And so if it's a Republican or if it's their same party, then that party can choose to extend it and keep people happy. If it's the other party in power, then their goal is that it expires, it doesn't get extended, and people don't like them. And so that's a game that gets played at the federal level quite a bit. And you'll actually see that, I think, kick in 2025. A number of the tax provisions that President Trump passed were sunsetted, so they'll expire automatically. And that will create some pretty significant cuts, to my knowledge, to the child tax credits, which will hurt a lot of Americans unless the government extends those. But again, they're doing that, trying to play some games with elections and different things. And so we as the people get caught in the middle of that sometimes. And then to your question about if Utah's doing what the US Congress does, issue a 4,000-page document. And I haven't yet seen a 4,000-page bill in Utah because Utah has the one subject requirement to it. In federal law, you can put tons of subjects in the same bill. And so quite often, if you're passing a bill on Medicaid, it will include funding for a dam in Tennessee or something like that. And that's just the political process playing out there. But here in Utah, it is one subject at least. There are 500 to 800 bills that come up. And no, I would say that don't try and watch all the bills. Don't try and be involved in all of them. I don't think it's possible for any one person to, unless that's all that you do with your life. But pick a topic or two that you really care about and make sure you follow all those bills. Be involved in a couple topics. And if everyone that's even participates in these calls takes the time to pick a topic or two, just sign up and say, alert me about these topics, alert me about these bills. You can get on and search the website for that topic. You'll be able to comment on those topics. And I found that among people, there's a pretty strong cross-section, or a pretty strong diversification of interests, where something that matters to me doesn't necessarily matter to someone else. And so you can do that and create that, trusting that if you do your part, other people will do their part. And that's how I found to manage sessions. But the thing to understand too about the bills is that the elected officials don't have time to read them all either. And this is where you have a lot of power to really influence things, is they usually read the highlighted provisions. They're not in the details of what the bill actually says. They're trusting what legislative research told them or what the bill sponsor told them. If they don't trust the bill sponsor, they may read it themselves. But I've seen a number of times where the bill sponsor openly says something about the bill that's just completely false because they didn't read it, or they didn't understand it. And I'm not here to fault them for that necessarily, because there is so much going on during a session. Utah crams it into 45 or so short days for their legislative session. There's a lot that these people that are elected are asked to do during that time. All kinds of meetings, all kinds of discussions. And it's a lot of work. And a lot of people give a lot to be up there and be involved. But that's where we come in to say, let's help out. Let's check the bill language and say, ooh, what's happening? And so as you look at a law, it's always helpful to ask, what's this really accomplishing? if all that I have to go off of is the language in the bill, what can I prove with it? Just relying on the language alone, what is it going to do? What is it going to impact? And if you start to ask questions about, okay, if they raise the sales tax percent, for example, what's that going to do? You can start to think through some of the ramifications of that. Why would someone want to change it? What unintended consequences might be there? And you can reach out to your rep about it. And so the question in the chat about finding a bill when you don't know the number. Let's see if I can come back here. If you come back to the 2023 general session, again, Utah's pretty good with a lot of what they do. But you can search bills. There's a number of different ways to search on the website. But an easy one is just to click on search up top. And let's say you're interested in school safety. So you just type in school safety and say search. It gives you obviously a lot of results over here. But they try and give you relevant ones. So if you're interested in school safety, the first bill that pops up is actually from 2023. You can see it right here, 2023 session, HB 61, and you can see that. Another bill that involves the term school and safety, just not quite together, is one that's also proposed this time with 2023. It's a youth sports safety amendments. And so we had the NFL issue recently with the NFL player having cardiac arrest on the field. And it looks like we have a bill. Maybe this bill even came before that, possibly, because of its lower number. So maybe they just, maybe this is an ongoing issue, but this one's talking about cardiac safety for participants in school athletic activities. And you can start to see those, but you can filter it on the side by bills. You can filter by just particular sessions. So if you're looking for the 2023 general session, you can just do that one. You can obviously include other sessions if you want in that to see who's talking about school safety and why. You can look at code, which is existing laws, and to see what there is. So we already have in existing law a Safe Utah and School Safety Commission that was established. And so this is part of the research you can do where if you're going, okay, we're creating a new school safety task force, why doesn't the existing School Safety Commission work? What are we really changing? Are we just spending more money at this point? And you can go in and look at those to see what exists and what doesn't. If you want to see what's been in committees, you can also go through that, see what committees have drafted on things. There is a school safety requirements from a 2022 report from an interim committee, it looks like, that talks about some of those. So Utah, I found, has made it has made information very accessible so that if you really do want to find something, you can do that. So I highly recommend that you look at these, go through this website, get familiar with it, make sure you understand it. You can do a keyword search of bills. I think that just pulls up bills. Maybe it's the same. It's the same that we just did. So a keyword search is the same as the search. But that's a great question because often that is something that is hard to do. So then you're asking, does the bill need both the House and Senate sponsor, and how would you help get one if needed? The bill absolutely does need both. So the bill sponsor, no matter which, it starts in the House or the Senate, the bill sponsor is the initial person that requested to be drafted, and they're putting it out there. But they do have to have someone willing to sponsor it in the other chamber, whether that's the Senate or the House. They're called the floor sponsor. And if you have a bill you like, it is not uncommon for the bill sponsor to say, I don't have a floor sponsor yet. And if that's the case, you can literally just start reaching out saying, hey, let's say it's a House bill, so you need a Senate floor sponsor. You can just start emailing senators and saying, hey, I really like this bill. Would you be willing to sponsor it? I'm trying to help get a sponsor. If you're not willing to sponsor it as a floor sponsor, do you know anyone that might be? And you can start to do some of that time lifting for these representatives, where you can take that and run with that to try and help people. And that's a big helpful thing that you can do. And again, it's something where it's surprising. You're kind of going, I think we often think, who am I to do something? But there are a few senators and representatives that will probably never respond to you. But for the most part in Utah, people will respond, especially if you live within their district. And if you can tell them, hey, you're one of the people I vote for, I'm one of your constituents, you can get a pretty strong response in Utah. I know when Mike Winder was in, he was my House rep for a time. And he told us that he'd only have about 30 constituents reach out to him during a session to tell him any opinions on the 800 or so bills that go through. So he tried very hard to listen very carefully to what his constituents said and asked him. And so that's something that you guys, again, can have the power to do with representatives. But let me know if there's questions. You can feel free to unmute yourself and ask one, or you can put it in chat. I want to show you just a little bit more about existing law before our time's up here today. But we have the Utah Code and Constitution. So if you're in the Code tab, they give you all of these to go through. And generally, if you just click on Code at the top, it takes you to the code. Utah Code is broken down into titles, and then chapters, and then sections. So when you see a bill reference like this one, so let's go back to our HB 61 that we were looking at. You're going to see three things: 53-22-101. And you can just start at the beginning. If you want to find this provision, again, you won't find it now because this one doesn't exist yet. But they're telling us that it's going to exist in section in Title 53, Public Safety Code. And then the next one was 22. So they're doing chapter 22. And you can see chapter 22 doesn't exist yet, which is why it's a new bill. But if that law does pass, there'd be a chapter 22 added here. But let's say we click on chapter 21, which is mental health resources for first responders. You're now going to be within 53-21, and you're going to have these various sections. There's definitions at the start. Most code provisions have definitions at the start, where they're going through telling you what mental health therapist means or what plan means. So here, to understand this law, you'd have to understand what plan means. You can click back out to see the next sections by just up here. All these are hyperlinked. You can move among chapters if you're at the chapter level. If you click on the section level, it takes you to the previous section or the next section to scroll through. You can download all these as PDFs or RTFs or XML files if you want to. And sometimes it's helpful if you're looking at a long code provision, and this is something going back to one of your questions about how do you find things. Let's say that you're interested in how they train police officers. These ones are actually broken into parts. The parts don't make it into any of the citations. So when you see the three numbers in a citation over here, 53, 22, 101, that doesn't include parts. But if you click on a part, you'll then see the sections. So part 1 usually has sections that start with 1. Part 2 usually has sections that start with 2, and so on. But let's say that I was interested in part 2 and I was looking through all of these. On the Utah website, if I click on it, I only get one section at a time. But I could download this entire section as a PDF if I click on that. And then within the PDF, you can say Control F and search for certain terms among the entire code, all these sections. And that's something that can save you a lot of time if you're searching as something very specific. So if you don't want the search results to give you everything, but you kind of know where you're at, go down to that level, download the PDF, and then search from there, and you can get a lot more information about what's taking place. So just before we end, I want to share with you a quick ambiguity that exists in Utah law that's currently being litigated. This isn't a case I'm involved in where we're arguing over statutory interpretation. I'm going to be curious to hear some of your opinions on this. So Utah has a Utah Anti-Discrimination Act that says you're not allowed to discriminate. It has a title which says how it's what it's called. So it says it's called the Utah Anti-Discrimination Act. It goes into definitions, which is pretty long for this one. It's a pretty long definition section. So they try and get very defined about what's taking place. But they have, this creates, so if you're being discriminated against at work, what this says is that you're supposed to file a claim with the Utah Labor Division, essentially. And so in the section 107, it talks about making a claim, and you're gonna make this claim with the division set up in Utah. And then it says here that the procedures contained in this section, so this section, again, there's title, chapter, and section. This right here is a section. We're in section 107. So it's saying that the procedures contained in this section are the exclusive remedy under state law for employment discrimination based upon, and then it goes through and lists these different things: race, color, sex, retaliation, etc. And so this means that an individual, even though it's against the law for your employer to fire you, for example, because you're a woman, you can't sue them for it under this Utah law. You have to file a claim with the Utah agency that's tasked with overseeing this. So if you look at where this section 107 sits, as you're trying to understand the law and what it says, there's this section 112 that comes up, this religious liberty protections. It's after section 107. And it talks about how an employer may not discharge, terminate, refuse to hire someone due to that person's expressive activity outside of the workplace regarding the person's religious, political, or personal convictions. And so currently we have a lawsuit where an employer, there's some employees that no longer work for the employer, but the employer has filed a lawsuit against them based on things they said. Because the employer has contracts and other things in place, and they say that these employees have said things that harm their business. But the employees take the position, hey, you can't sue me for what I said because Utah law says, I can't be sued for that. And so in defending the lawsuit, they filed a claim saying, hey, you're breaking this law. You're discriminating against us under this. You can't come after us for these things that we said. The other side, the employer, is moving to dismiss the claim, saying that under this Chapter 5, this Utah Anti-Discrimination Act, that all of its claims can only be enforced by the Labor Commission and not by the courts. And so it's interesting because the section 112 sits outside of section 107 that says that certain claims are the only procedure is through the Labor Commission, essentially. And so if you drill down in Utah and you say, okay, section 112, what happens? Utah tells us when this section 112 came to be. It came to be in 2015. The Utah anti-discrimination laws existed before that. But 2015 put this into place. If you want to see the actual bill that did, you can actually just click here, it hyperlinks it. And they pull up the bill to see, and you can see what happened during this time. It's a pretty long bill. But as you go through it, you'll see that they were adding in sexual orientation and gender identity as something you can't discriminate against people on. But as part of that compromise, they added in that section 112 a little bit later down here that said that people can't be discriminated against based on what they feel or say, in the workplace. And in looking at this, the question again is, well, was this 112 enforceable in court? Can a court do anything about it, or is it the Labor Commission only? Because it's part of this chapter. And if you come up here just a little bit before, you can see that the legislature actually amended this line that says it's the exclusive remedy under state law for employment discrimination based upon sexual orientation and gender identity. They added those two in. And then a little bit below, they added in this section 112, but they didn't say claims under 112. But they also didn't say that individuals that 112 doesn't apply to the general rule of this chapter overall. So I'm curious to hear what some of you think about that issue. If you were interpreting that statute, would you say that employees should be able to make a claim in court if they're being sued for something that they supposedly said? Or do you think that statute was intended to say Section 112 applies to, Section 112 has to be through the division as well? Curious if any of you have any comments on that. It's part of our statutory discussion. And it is, to your point, Drew, a can of worms for sure. But it is one that, if you read it, you can ask questions such as, well, should an employee be able to be sued? Should the employer be able to sue and then say, hey, you can't make a claim back because we're suing you for what you said, but hey, you can't do that. But what if the bill did say the exclusive remedy was in, the discrimination division? What's the employee supposed to do? Those are things that I don't think that the drafting attorneys fully think through. And so this is something that, even though you can look at laws and you can look at what happened, there are a lot to, there's a lot to unpack still. And so when you're reviewing things, I bring the situation up because if you're reviewing things and looking at the law, you can say, whoa, 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 you've left a big hole here. You didn't address this issue. And if you point that out to a legislator, you can often help them because they can introduce floor amendments. They can introduce new provisions to go in. So for example, if it makes it out of committee to the whole floor, they can add provisions, they can change language, they can introduce substitute bills. And it is always interesting to see how that takes place. But so as we go through these bills, so we're going to start tomorrow. We'll be doing a similar thing tomorrow night. I know some of you signed up for both sessions, but tomorrow night we'll be looking at going through this introduction again. But then from here on out, Tuesdays and Wednesdays, we'll be going through bills that you're interested in. If no one suggests one, we'll just start going through the list, looking at them. We hope to have discussions on them. Hope you guys will, go through and look at these things because we want to get good laws in place. We want to solve some problems. Sometimes that means the government gets involved. Sometimes it means we tell the government not to be involved. But I look forward to going through this with you guys, working on it. And so if you would like to join the team's discussion, the chat and the sharing of files and things that takes place, please email us and let us know, and we can get you a Teams invite where, in addition to this meeting, you can be in a chat that just is ongoing, where you can ask questions about bills. We can talk about the pros and cons. You can get feedback on language, proposed language, all those kinds of things. So thanks everyone for being here. We sure appreciate you guys. And again, email if you have questions, but we'll plan on seeing you more tomorrow or next week.